and education research. Very, very helpful. Before I pass the floor to Dr. Ahmed, I would like to briefly provide bits from her fantastic research career. So Dr. Farah Ahmed is a senior research associate at the Faculty of Education, University of Cambridge, and her research interests lie in the intersections between dialogic education, philosophies of Islamic education, Southern theory, which is critical and indigenous research methodologies, and identity, personhood, character education. Dr. Ahmed is particularly interested in ontological, epistemological, and theoretical frameworks and how these influence classroom practice. Dr. Ahmed has over 25 years of experience teaching in and leading Islamic schools in the UK, and she has expertise in curriculum development and have developed and taught teacher professional development courses on Islamic education. Her main specialisms are philosophies, pedagogies, and practices. Dr. Ahmed convenes the Cambridge Dialogues, Renewing Islamic Education Theory into Practice academic research network. Her research centers on using dialogical halaqah to develop Shakhsiyah Islamiyah, and this is translated into practice through the online international Islamic Educator Learning Community. In 2002, Dr. Ahmed co-founded Islamic Shakhsiyah Foundation, which runs Shakhsiyah Schools, and the schools grew out of homeschooling projects. And for over 20 years, Farah has led the development of Shakhsiyah Education Model, which is a holistic integrated approach to education that draws on classical Islamic educational thought and contemporary research. Dr. Ahmed served as head teacher for 12 years, and she is now Director of Education and the lead developer of Shakhsiyah Halaqah and holistic thematic curricula. She is the author of Principles of Shakhsiyah Education and Dialogic Halaqah, a guide for the Muslim educator. Dr. Ahmed, thank you very much for joining us, and I am sure everyone is going to benefit immensely from your expertise and your research. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I want to first of all just say, Jazakallah khairan. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk about this topic. This is a topic that I haven't talked about that much, but I'm hoping that we're going to have a really great dialogue about it, inshallah, after I've introduced some ideas. So the title of the talk is Deen, Dunya, Knowledge and Research. And I'm going to be hopefully introducing some guiding principles and design questions for Muslim researchers. Okay, so Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So I want to start off by just looking at conceptualizing research as something that is embedded within scholarship and Islamic epistemology. And I think this is really fundamental because part of the image that we have on the screen here, we're looking at what most people would see as Islamic scholars, people who are ulama, who studied the Islamic sciences, but you can see here that what they're working with are some scientific instruments. And so when you normally look at an image like this, you don't think scientist, you don't think social scientist, you don't think academic, you don't think researcher, you think a scholar. So the question that I want to kind of pose is, well, what's the difference between scholarship and research? And in my mind, I actually think that is a false dichotomy. I think that one of the challenges that we have as an ummah, as Muslim researchers, as people working in the academy, as people from the global south, is that this separation of research with traditional forms of learning, in Islam we would tend to call that scholarship, is in itself a problem. And as a Muslim, how can I think that what I'm doing is research and isn't scholarship? Having said that, I have a caveat, because as a Muslim, I don't have the kind of traditional learning or an expertise in methodologies that are used in the Islamic disciplines to say that I am a scholar in that regard. So there's this anomaly that presents itself that many of us feel. My work is, my actual research is around challenging double consciousness in young Muslims in the UK. I've developed this idea of Shakhsiyah Islamiyah as a way to challenge that double consciousness, and through using dialogic halaqah to achieve Shakhsiyah Islamiyah and to address the double consciousness that we all face. Now, double consciousness, if you're not familiar with that, is the idea that as Muslims in a non-Islamic setting, we are constantly having to think in two different worldviews, two different paradigms at the same time, consistently. So that poses a lot of problems, and it poses challenges that we need to navigate. So the idea of today's talk is, how do we navigate those challenges? And the first point I'm going to make is that actually in our community, at least, and as scholars and researchers, we need to kind of break down the barrier between what is scholarship and what is research. And we need to acknowledge the limitations we have in doing that, and we need to be humble about how we do it. However, we need to break down these barriers. The second point I'm going to make is that we need to kind of reconceptualize how we understand Deen and Dunya. Now, Deen and Dunya, as many people will sort of see these as two kind of separate things that are pulling in different directions, and that you have to balance. And oftentimes the way we think about this is a little bit how we think about work-life balance, right? Is like, how much time am I spending on my commitments that I want as a person, as a human being in my life, and how much time am I spending on my work? And sometimes we think about Deen and Dunya in this kind of way, is that how much time am I spending in my ibadah, how much time am I spending learning my Quran, and then how much time am I spending making earning a living or living my life. And actually, again, I think that this is a false dichotomy. I think that this is something that has the way that we understand it now. I'm not saying these terms are new, they're not new terms, but I feel that the way we understand this in our current situation is a modernist or a postmodernist way of looking at Islam. And this separation of Deen and Dunya is also problematic. So what I want to propose is that actually the way we understand the Deen has always got to be in the context for the Dunya. So when I was teaching with young children, I'd always say to them, well, the Deen has been sent for the Dunya. So Deen al-Islam, as we know it, is not what we will be following in the Akhirah, right? The Akhirah is something which is completely different. Akhirah being the hereafter, after we die, what happens. That is we're going to be in a different dimension, different plane. The Deen that has been sent, that is revealed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, has been revealed for the dunya. I have written a paper regarding this, like exploring this a little bit on Hadith Jibreel, which opens up the concept of what Deen is. So if you're interested in what I mean by that, you can look that up. But the point I'm trying to make is that this is we should be, as Muslims, we are understanding the dunya through the Deen, and we should be understanding the Deen as something that is lived within the dunya. And if we can look at it in that way, then that shifts how we approach everything, including how we approach knowledge, how we approach scholarship, how we approach our work as researchers. Okay, so I can't talk about what I'm going to go ahead and talk about without mentioning the first kind of mass movement in terms of decolonizing or post-colonial movement of knowledge, which happened in the late 70s, all through the end of the 20th century, and I want to say in the beginning of the 21st century, but it's been going on now. People are still working on this for about 50 years, which is sometimes referred to as Islamization of knowledge, and it emerges out of the World Conferences on Muslim Education, when a lot of ulama and academics and researchers and people come together. People like Naqib al-Atas and Sayyid Ali Ashraf and Sayyid Nasser and Ismail Faruqi. There's some of these giant names that have a huge impact on the Muslim academic world. And they are thinking about what can be done in terms of addressing this issue, where you have traditional scholarship on the one hand, you have the Western Academy and universities being built in the Muslim world, which are just completely on a Western model, and the ruptures that that's causing. A lot of the work they do is around higher education and Islamization of disciplines. It is important to say that all four of the names I mentioned and other people they approach this in very different ways. Often we've kind of lumped this together, and there's a lot of critique about the kind of ways that this work was approached, and a lot of people say, oh, it was a big failure. I don't agree with that. I think that it was an effort for its time, in some ways ahead of its time. There is much that to be learned from it. I actually, when I was a master's student, my master's was actually in educational research, so I had a lot of time to look at research methodologies. So I studied the Islamization movement in some depth and the various branches of the Islamization movement. And I can say that I have drawn on some of that in the work that I do and how I approach things. However, that we do need to move to speak to the current academy, and there are ideas that we can take that will strengthen this work and take it in a different direction. So I'm not saying that the work has solved everything either, but it's important to acknowledge that we should be building on the work of people who've come before us. So how am I approaching this? So one of the things that I took inspiration from as was mentioned in the introduction, is Southern theory and critical and indigenous pedagogies. Sorry, critical and indigenous research methodologies. I do look at the pedagogy side of it as well, but that's more the content of my research. But what I'm talking about today is research. So, and that I found, what I found was actually incredibly useful to me, and I haven't got a slide on it, but I found some research principles adopted, which were known as Kaupapa Maori. And these were adopted by Maori people in New Zealand to help them think through their place in research in the Western Academy. And Indigenous research has its own history. I don't have a lot of time to go to talk about it, but I thought that was a really incredible idea. And I actually thought that that is something that for a researcher I would find incredibly useful. So I developed these 6 research principles. I also looked at, there were a couple of other people who had spoken about this. Zahra Al-Zira has written a beautiful book called Wholeness and Holiness in Education, something along those lines, if you look that up. And she talked about some principles and so on. And Jasmine Zine talked about some critical faith-based principles, but I felt that those were really useful, but I wanted to kind of take inspiration from all the things I've been reading and put together some principles that would be useful in my own work. Now, I do have a talk which was done 10 years ago where I explained how I translated these principles into my own master's research. And since then, I've always referred back to them for my PhD and then postdoc and further research projects that I've been involved with. But today, I'm not going to talk so much about how I translate them into my own practice. What I'm going to talk about is the principles themselves in a lot more depth. And then I'm going to talk about producing design questions to help researchers translate these principles into something of relevance in thinking through their own research design. That's the objective of today's talk. And I won't be able to go into all of them in as much depth as I'd like to, but I'm just going to sort of pick on certain things to give you a flavor of how this might work. This work that I'm presenting here is a work in progress, and inshallah, I'll be putting together a toolkit, which will be available on inshallah, a new Cambridge Dialogues website within the next few weeks, hopefully. So the first, the research principles are 6. I may be adding a couple, but at the moment there's 6. So they are the principle of the primacy of Quran and Hadith as sources, and sources that cannot be challenged in terms of their primacy. These are the foundational sources of knowledge in Islam. The second principle of combining classical Islamic scholarship and sciences with a range of other research methods, which I've already alluded to. The third is the principle of using all our human faculties of understanding, intellectual, rational, intuitive, and spiritual. The principle of centering the human situation in research, so that the purpose of any research that we're doing has to be the situation of the human beings that research is serving. The principle of adopting Islamic ethics and etiquette. Of course, there will be other research ethics that we need to think about, but Islamic ethics and etiquette in anything that we do as researchers. And the principle of collaborative, participative, transformative, and useful research. all of these are features that have to be built into the research design to honor the Islamic nature of the research that we're doing. So these are the principles. So what I'll do now is explain them a little bit further and start looking at some design questions, and then and for some of the design questions, some worked examples of what that might look like. So the first principle is, as I said, is the principle of the primacy of the Quran and prophetic sayings. And in some ways, this is fairly, it's in some ways it's quite easy to kind of work with, but in some ways it's incredibly challenging because there is appears to be such a gulf between the Quran and any kind of research methodology, whether you're looking at some quantitative data sets with statistical analysis based on a positivist paradigm, or whether you're looking at an autoethnography, so on. It might be like, it feels like these things are coming from a complete gulf. But the first thing I want to say is that as a source of knowledge, we need to center this. And it's the ultimate guiding forces for us as Muslim researchers if we are to adopt an Islamic paradigm. So I've come up with 4 research principles, research design questions, which might help us translate this. The first one is, are the Quran and Hadith relevant to my research? And if so, in what way? So just starting to unpack that, just sort of like blue sky thinking. And the worked example I've given here is from a current PhD student at Cambridge, who is looking at introducing something. He's developed this idea called Islamic scientific critical consciousness, and he's been using that to research what's happening with Muslim children as they're learning in learning science in UK schools. So that's the context. So I asked him to sort of like try and look at this, and one of the things he said is that Quran and Sunnah are foundational first principles from which this idea of Islamic scientific critical consciousness has been formulated. For example, human beings are viewed as the creation of Allah, with life being full of meaning, responsibility, and trials. So part of the research that he's thinking about, the way that he's conceptualizing things, is centering this idea of what a human being is. And he's taking that from the Quranic narrative. And he's also taking the scholarship of a Pakistani thinker, Muhammad Iqbal, and his idea of khudi, which is kind of agency or the selfhood. And that itself is based upon Surah Hashr. So you can see how he's taking, it's a direct kind of like transition from the Quran into his research, and we're bringing together that scholarship and the research work that he's doing. So do I see any contradiction between the Quran and or Hadith and my research? And I think that's another way of asking question 1A, is there any contradiction? And if so, how would I tackle it? So his response is that he's using something called Islamic critical realism, which is an idea developed by Matthew Wilkinson. But the foundation of this is the belief that human beings have limited access and understanding of the many layers of reality, which actually links to another research principle, and I will talk about that when I get to it. And it is Allah who leads the researcher. But I thought this was a really interesting response from him. He said, it's Allah who leads the researcher to the truth if he wills. So to think about, if there is a contradiction, then I, as a Muslim, will rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taking me towards the truth. So question 1C, is there specific knowledge in Quran and Hadith that I can draw on in my research or in my research design? And then he's drawn on some specific Quranic examples. He gives Surah Alaq, the first 5 ayats where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about creation. He talks about how he created us with and taught by the pen. And he's given various other verses that he finds are relevant. But sometimes we might want to be looking at the verses that speak to our methodology, verses that speak to our research questions, verses that speak to the topic that we're, and trying to draw those out and kind of maybe just note them down and have those in our research journals to refer back to. 1D, in what ways am I ensuring the primacy of Quran and Hadith in my scholarship and research? And he gives an interesting answer to this, which will lead very firmly into the second research principle, which is the language in which I see Islamic scientific critical consciousness is framed, is based on Islamic ontology and epistemology, which does actually make me think that we might need another principle which talks specifically about ontology and epistemology, but we don't have that currently. I might introduce that. But currently, the second principle is that of combining classical Islamic scholarship and sciences with a range of other research methods. And this I've spent a little bit more time explaining what this means. Now, a lot of us are not fully aware of, and we don't understand the traditional methodologies for understanding both the revealed texts, but also other ones such as creation, nature, the natural sciences, and that these have an important role to play in helping Muslims understand new knowledge and address new scientific, social, and human issues. And this is what I'm trying to get at here is that we have, it's in Islamic scholarship, you have what we call ulum, which is Islamic sciences. So we have like ulum al-Quran, the sciences of studying the Quran. But then we have like kalam, which is sciences of, which is sometimes translated as theology. We even have falsafa, which was looking at Aristotelian or Greek philosophy. There were specific methodologies developed to help Muslims think about and not generate new knowledge, but interpret the texts and create knowledge that could be applied to their current situation. So where do those methodologies fit in with the kind of contemporary research principles research methodologies that we work with? What I'm arguing is that relying on classical thought with all its diversity, and there is huge diversity within these methodologies, will generate authenticity and a continuation of the Islamic tradition. One way for us to rebuild and renew and enhance and make this tradition relevant to today is to connect our work to it, which we will have limitations too. I myself don't have the knowledge capacity to do that. But I do have currently a PhD student who has more learning in this regard than I do and may be able to do that in a better way. The classical methodologies naturally generate holistic Islamic meanings and moral guidance on application of knowledge for human sustainability and environmental conservation. So now some of the concerns that we have of a post-human world, environmental collapse, actually our own scholarship can help us address this. So the research that we're doing regarding these things, there's a lot that we can gain from our own scholarship. Most research methodologies are compatible with Islamic epistemology. Once the Islamic paradigm is made the conceptual framework. Now, we need to unpack terms such like worldview and paradigm and so on. But as shorthand, if the thinking that we're doing is from an Islamic basis, then that conceptual framework shapes everything we do. Pretty much you can use any methodology within that broad kind of paradigm, and the principles will help us sort of translate that. Methodologies and methods should be selected to meet the objectives of the research and in line with other principles that we might want to adopt to help us, but as well as these specific principles. So there has to be a network of things going on. I'm not saying that this will bring everything together for your research, but this will be one very useful toolkit inshallah, for Muslim researchers to help align what they're doing as researchers with their faith commitments. Okay, so questions from this research principle about integrating classical scholarship with contemporary methodologies. So one might be, how far do I understand the differences between methodologies in Islamic disciplines and contemporary secular disciplines? So do an evaluation. What do I already know? Perhaps I can pick up a book which gives me a good, a generic idea about how Islamic methodologies might work. What paradigm are Islamic methodologies built on? This might need to be drawn out as a principle itself, but specifically ontology and epistemology. So this is kind of embedded in this at the moment. Whenever we're talking about research paradigms, people talk about ontology and epistemology. What does Islam have to say regarding this? Because we have a belief, this connects directly back to our Aqidah. Can I identify any methodologies from the Islamic sciences that might be useful in my research? So when I'm looking at Halaqah, again, with another PhD student, we've looked at identifying types of thinking in Halaqah, like tafakkur, tadabbur, and so on, which are not necessarily methodologies, but these are forms of learning, forms of thinking about things, which are useful for us in our research, but are also there present in Islamic methodologies. In what ways does the Islamic paradigm shape or align with the theoretical framework that I'm adopting. So what you will have seen in the example from Islamic Scientific Critical Consciousness, that is the theoretical framework that is being introduced into a setting, and then some empirical research is being done around that. And there is a clear trajectory from the Islamic worldview, Islamic scholarship into that theoretical framework. How might I design my methodology on the basis of this Islamic paradigm? So this is now a much broader question. And again, it will take quite a bit of work, but hopefully some of the other research principles that we'll go through will help do this, this work. So the third principle is of using all human faculties of understanding, intellectual, rational, intuitive, and spiritual. Now, this principle I wrote back in 2014, and since then there's been some really amazing work being done by Professor Rajab Senchuk, where he's coined this term multiplexity, which kind of really encapsulates this, and he talks about this at the level of ontology, epistemology, and the human person, which I think is a really excellent way of understanding why this is important. But what I was thinking about when I put this principle together was that knowledge is not simply empirical. And even most researchers in the social research will know that there is some interpretation that happens to that which is rational. There is some hermeneutics involved. There is some, I would argue, some intuition involved, and there is some as Muslims, there is some spirituality involved. And that comes from understanding the human being, that first of all, the human understanding of the natural, social, and human worlds can't simply be empirical or rational. Human faculties of knowing include the aql, the intellect, which has a different meaning than just reason and isn't just cognitive, but it's also located in the qalb, the heart. And so you can see immediately here a more complex understanding of what that might look like. Now, Islamic methodologies, Islamic scholarship, we have some really deep work on logic, on munadara, which is like argumentation, on dialectics, very rational, cognitive type methodologies. But we also say, the ulama have always said the seat of the aql is the qalb. And that rationality is couched within, housed within deeper intuition. There is also the ruh, all of which are interrelated with each other and with the nafs. So human knowing is interested by all these other different kind of faculties, not just the reason or empirical observation. So we need a more holistic approach to be accepted to recognize these multiple forms of human meaning and knowledge. And I'm introducing here ma'na, meaning, as well as ilm, knowledge, because these things need to be worked together. And here I take inspiration from Sayyid Naqib al-Attas's work as well. Having said all of this, our research must be rigorous and peer-reviewed, because what I'm arguing is that, and it's not to say that I can say, well, I've had an unveiling, a kashf from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and now I'm claiming that this knowledge is objective knowledge, is truth. That's not what I'm saying. And the ulama always had a principle that there is objective truth, like there are forms of knowledge that can be tested, and those in the dunya, in the physical empirical world, and in the social world, and those we would make claims about. There are other forms of knowledge that come through inspiration, and that we would only see that as valid and rigorous if it can add to what we can know through the empirical and the rational. So nobody is saying here you replace, like, there is no truth and my truth is what is true. As Muslims, there is a truth. The truth lies with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're trying to uncover and understand it. But as Muslims, we don't have one way of doing that. We have multiple ways of doing that, and they need to work together. And our aim is ultimately truth, which is therefore any work that we do has to be rigorous. There needs to be peer review. Peer review is very much built into our tradition and to ensure validity and authenticity. I'm going to speed up a little bit now, but with design questions for this principle is: how far do I acknowledge or use the multiple layers of being and knowing in the Islamic paradigm? How can I use any existing knowledge I have, the Islamic understanding of these multiplex human faculties of knowing, to think about the data I am seeking out? What forms of analysis might do justice to this data beyond the empirical? Right. So one thing that you might want to think about here is that if you're working with Muslims, Muslims will talk about the hype, right? They will say, oh, you know, I felt I was in the masjid and I felt that there was some sukoon there because I felt that maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent some presence of angels. How do you make sense of that unless you acknowledge that for Muslims at least there are other ways of knowing? And so that just on that very basis, to give that its due, we need to be acknowledging that in our research. So the fourth principle is centering the human situation. Now, why is this so important? And I think this is important because for me, it's like it's a bit of a counter to how the secular academy approaches research, where the human beings are often an afterthought. They're considered to be subjects that because and this is a hangover from the time of positivism, and we're moving away from it. And I'm not saying that we don't have a strong research ethics. In many fields we do, but we still have this hangover of treating human beings as subjects the same way we would treat any subjects in a scientific experiment. So I feel that that is not how we as Muslim researchers can look at human beings. So as social researchers, we need to be thinking about centering the human situation. Research should meet the holistic needs of human beings as individuals and as collective. And the human situation should be the core of all research. It's applicable in all endeavors of knowledge seeking, but especially when we're doing social research. And it should have this broad, holistic, qualitative, interdisciplinary approach, which incorporates reductive elements. So you can take some of this reductivism or positivism, but only as one strand for a more detailed understanding, but ultimately it has to be purposeful for human beings. So how can we ensure that happens? And I think the design questions will sort of support this a little bit, because does my research acknowledge the fitra, the human nature of how we understand what human nature is, as having an awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as human beings, as khairul khalqillah, as human beings, as Khalifatul Ard, custodians of the earth. And these concepts of centering what the human being is, how do these concepts affect my research design? Is there anything reductive about my research? Does my research design reduce human beings to some sort of organic mechanical objects that can be studied through isolating variables? If it does, how does that fit with the rest of what I'm trying to do? In what ways might I use quantitative or statistical analysis without compromising this principle? So I'm not saying that you can't do quantitative work, but I'm saying that we need a principle to ensure that that doesn't become reductive. Okay, principle 5 is of Islamic ethics and etiquette. As a Muslim, everything I do is for the pleasure of Allah. Given this foundation, how can I ensure that my niyyah is pure? Because this is a deeper thing, niyyah being that I'm doing this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Having reviewed the ethics code for my research discipline, are there any other ethical concerns that I need to consider in light of Islamic teaching? So, for example, as an educational researcher, I subscribe to the British Educational Research Association's research guide, ethics, code of ethics, but what else do I need to add in as a Muslim for this specific research study that would uphold my Islamic ethics? Beyond ethics, is there any respectful comportment? And there are deeper meanings of other, but that is also a meaning which is significant that I need to consider in my research design in terms of how I'll be interacting perhaps with my participants, with the community I'm researching, with fellow colleagues. How am I going to comport myself? And the final principle is of collaborative, participative, transformative, and useful research. And this, like principle 4, is there to try and address some of the ills of positivism, if you like. So again, this research should be serving the people who are researched. How is my research empowering and offering practical and real solutions? Am I just being extractive, doing the research, going off, getting my PhD, publishing some articles, and then, I've benefited from it, and the people that have given me their time or this community, they're not getting anything out of it. So to help me think about that, what is the niyyah? And niyyah in a different way, not niyyah as in for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but niyyah is in what is my intention, purpose, aim, or objective in this specific research design? Is it going to be useful to my community, the wider Muslim ummah, and humanity? And so again, this is the same and a worked example from the same study about Islamic scientific critical consciousness. And what is being said here, to recenter and decolonize Islamic ways of thinking and doing practice in science education. So this is how it will benefit Muslim communities, for the educators, for educator policy designers, and for students. In relation to my commitment to honor human beings as more than subjects of my research, have I worked collaboratively with participants in my research project? So this particular project, the worked example there involves action research. So it's very collaborative in 2 different schools. Now, this is interesting. One is a faith school, but one is a secular school. But a secular school with a majority Muslim cohort. So finding ways of working that honor my faith and be of service to all the people in these schools and communities. How am I going to do that? Does the project directly benefit the community being researched? Now, this is not necessarily just the Muslim community, as we've already seen this in this example. If so, how? So school-based action research changes and improvements will directly impact the schools and the communities involved. So you can see how this principle will hold you fast to an Islamic paradigm and Islamic worldview. And I hope what I've illustrated here is that by having these kind of principles and design questions, as Muslim researchers, we can, inshallah, center our worldview in the work that we do and move away from being Muslims over here, this is my deen, and our research over here, this is my dunya, and sort of see the deen as an application for our life in this world, inshallah. I'm going to stop talking there. I hope you found that useful, inshallah, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Ahmed. That was very, very interesting and thought-provoking. We have 2 questions in the chat, but if you have any further queries, please feel free to put them in the chat box or come off mute and